You say that you have no Irish background. Why did you choose this topic? What brought you to write a book on women in the Easter Rising?
I have an answer to that, but first I want to make sure that the people in the back can hear me. I know I'm being recorded, but I don't know if I'm being magnified. Can you guys in the back hear me? Okay?
Okay.
You can? Okay, good. Okay. Well, actually, there was one inspiring, originary episode that I will talk about. In 1991, Helen Litton, who is the grandniece of Kathleen Clark, published her edition of Kathleen Clark's autobiography. And I guess someone from Limerick counts as a woman of the South. Does Kathleen Clark? Good, so I'll begin with her. And this episode, one episode in her book, which is called Revolutionary Woman, stuck out for me. And I was always amazed to find that people I knew, women I knew in Ireland, hadn't read the book and hadn't heard of this one episode. And it's my absolute favorite of all of them, so I will tell you that. Kathleen Clark was not out in the Rising because her husband didn't want her to be out. He was, as you know, he was at the epicenter of the revolution, but he had given her the responsibility of taking care of the money that was going to be the volunteer, the dependence fund that would take care of the families of people who were killed in the Rising or for some reason sent away. And she had charge of all this money, much of which had come from America, from John Devoy, and it was several thousand pounds. And so on May 2nd, 1916, she had no idea what was happening. Tom Clark hadn't texted her or anything like that, so there was no way of knowing. But she was very anxious, as well she might have been, and she was planting cauliflowers. I thought, since we're in a market, it's good to begin with vegetables. She was planting cauliflowers, and a neighbor of hers, whom she refers to only as an old lady, arrived at her house and wanted to know what was happening, which Kathleen Clark didn't know. So she and the old lady were talking downstairs with Kathleen Clark's maid. For a lot of my women in 1916, they have no money. They're very poor, but they always have a maid, and which was the times, it was very cheap. This maid was from the Aran Islands. She was a young girl named Sarah. So Sarah was in the kitchen, and the old lady and Kathleen Clark were in the front of the house. And Kathleen Clark heard lorries coming down Richmond Avenue, and she knew it was the British military. And she knew that she had about a minute to do something. Anything that had to be hidden immediately. And the one thing she had that was valuable were those several thousand pounds, which she knew she would never see again. And so she had to hide it somewhere. And because she'd been in the garden with cauliflowers, at first she thought of hiding them there, and then she thought that was too obvious. The first place you look for something hidden is to dig in the garden. So she thought, and she was looking at the old lady, and she had an idea. And she started unbuttoning the old lady's bodice. She says the woman was wearing an old-fashioned bodice. I think it's what I would call a blouse. So she started unbuttoning the woman, and she was very anxious, and she said she was shaking. And the old lady, as she calls her, began shaking. But Kathleen Clark took this money, and whether it was paper or coin or both, I don't know, but she stuffed it in the woman. Kathleen Clark had been a dressmaker in Limerick, so she was used to operating around women's bodies. She also had a million sisters. So she stuffed the money in this woman and was just buttoning the last button when she heard rifles knocking on her door. But she then says a sentence, which is one of my favorite sentences describing something that happened in 1916. She said, "Her ample bust was not noticeably increased by the added bulk." And I love that. And to me, this was the major event of 1916. And I always wondered why no one had heard of it. Why wasn't it being taught in the schools, Because it also seemed to me this was what there was of this was the treasury of the emergent Irish state that had been proclaimed but wasn't altogether there yet. And this was its treasury, this was its welfare fund, and it was in this woman's, on top of her breasts and her arms. And, it seemed to me there was something very important there because it was a matter of state. It was very official, and yet it was hidden in this woman's body by another woman. And so I always thought this was very significant. I mean, it was, as Pat was quoting what I liked, it was quirky, it was totally intimate, it was something that happened between women, and yet it was very significant, and it would sustain the families of the revolutionaries. I mentioned this, I talked about it with Helen Litton, who, of course, was in the Daily Family, and she said that, in fact, later, Kathleen Clark had a lot of trouble getting the money back from this woman, and that a priest had to intervene. It wasn't clear how the priest factored in this, but that was the family story. A priest and don't even go there, as they say, but he had to intervene. Anyway, that was, to me, that was a wonderful story, and I kept thinking, this is also part of 1916 history, even though Helen Litton and Kathleen Clark and I seem to be the only people who know about it. I mean, obviously other people read the book, but to me this was central in some way. And Kathleen Clark's memoir is it's called Revolutionary Woman, and it's full of lots of little episodes like this that to me seemed very important, but were not about bullets or battalions or volunteer uniforms or ammunition and barricades. It had nothing to do with any of that, but really it was like the essence of the future Irish state that was hidden, in an intimate part of this woman's body. And so maybe I've talked enough about that, but that to me, that was, the book began when I read that story, though it didn't fully begin then, but that was what inspired it.
Thank you, Lucy. That gives us a flavour. And I'll just add that, I mean, you may want to mention this yourself in a few minutes, but my first acquaintance with your 1916 work was, I think, one of the first, what eventually became a chapter in the book that you gave as a lecture at the University of Limerick, and it really caught my eye. It was called Undressing on the Asgard. Right. We come back to that, because, I mean, it's such an interesting story. You can probably guess. But I suppose what I wanted to say was that, what I wanted to ask and get you to say a bit about is, how is your book different from other books or other studies about women in 1916? Because I suppose we were talking about this earlier and remarking that a lot of there's huge amounts now being done about women in 1916 and in the whole period, which is really great. I mean, it is so transformed from when we grew up with nothing but the men and the fighting. But still there is a tendency to emphasise active participants, right. Constance Markovich, Margaret Skinnett, or people who are out there with their guns. And this is your angle is a bit different. Will you say a bit about that?
Right. I mean, at one time I described it to myself as the rising without bullets, though if you talk about Margaret Skinner, you have to bring in the bullets. But for me, the basic material for me was the women's own accounts, what they said, their own words. And there's lots of those words. So it began with Kathleen Clark. I then discovered that Mary Spring Rice, who had helped run the guns on the Asgard, had also written a memoir, also with these kind of girly details about things like where she and Molly Childers slept on the Asgard. It was a tiny little hatch, tiny little place on the bottom level of the boat, and they couldn't close the door. They wouldn't have been able to breathe. It was too stuffy. But if it was open, how could they bathe? I mean, they were the only women, and there were 4 or 5 men. And so they hung a tea towel there. And Mary Spring Rice is full of details about how they bathed, how they undressed, how when they were on the voyage back and they were sleeping on top of 600 rifles, how hairpins fell among the rifles and so forth. So I loved the girly details there, and again, I felt hairpins, that's also part of 1916. So my inspiration began with the women's own words, and so I kept looking for more memoirs and autobiographies of women who have been involved in any way at all. And then just a few years ago, as many of you probably know, the Bureau of Military History released all of the first-person accounts. They had recorded accounts of men and women who were active in anything in the public sphere between 1913 and 1923. And these were all online, and they make wonderful reading. They're really terrific. I mean, it's my favorite website, and my favorite reading is these statements, and there's over 1,000 of them, and several hundred are by women. So that was my material. I thought it was wonderful.
I was just going to ask you what was the important new material.
There's a longer answer. So the main difference is that I wasn't looking for external statistics. I was looking for what did the women say, and what did they experience, and how did they talk about it. So diaries and letters, interviews with them, anything like that. Everything in the first person. So that's the main reason it's different. It's also different because I decided if my interest was gender, it was gender and so across political lines. So I have several unionist women in there too. Elsie Mahaffey, who was the daughter of the then provost of Trinity, John Pentland Mahaffey, wrote really what is the very first history of the Rising. And of course, as many of you know, the British Army was quartered at Trinity. And Elsie's point of view is not like Kathleen Clark's point of view at all. But it's a fascinating diary. And I'll just tell you one thing. If you've read this book, you'll see it. Elsie wrote an account of the Rising on right-hand pages of a book. It's still in her handwriting. It's never been published. And on the left-hand pages, it's more or less a scrapbook with mass cards for the executed men and maps and letters from Bowen Coulter's, letters from Plunkett. I don't know how she got those. But my absolute favorite one, it must be her favorite too because it's in the front, is a thank you note from General Maxwell to the provost. And it thanks him, it's General Maxwell writing in October 1916 to Mahaffey, to John Mahaffey, and he said, thanks him for your hospitality during my recent brief stay in Ireland. And I thought, why doesn't everybody know about this wonderful letter about the nice Easter holiday that Maxwell had, in Ireland? So I have so Women's Own Words, Unionist women, and what interested me, as inspired by The Money in the Bodice, was what the sociologist Irving Goffman calls small behaviors. Yeah. I was interested in these little details. I must say Goffman came into this very late in the game. I had to find theoretical justification for what I was doing, or, why would anybody read the book if I didn't have a theorist in there somewhere? So I found that Goffman actually justified what I was doing, but I was interested in these just because I liked them. And originally I was just talked about Schelte, and everybody said, you can't just talk about Schelte, why? And because I enjoy them. But in fact, I discovered, or I found it within myself to say that all of these Schelte actually revealed in a very basic way what it was like when women joined men in the public sphere. And that's what they showed. So that's a long answer to the question, how is the book different?
Yeah, I mean, having heard most of it and read the rest, it is extraordinarily different from actually anything else that I've read. And one of the reasons is, I think, that Lucy is professionally, she's a reader of texts. And what she does with these archives and with the letters and the journals is she doesn't look through them. And I'm not going to tag, there are some wonderful historians here, so I'm not going to make an offensive generalization. Historians look through the text to the event. They no longer do that, of course. But Lucy especially, she pauses on the text and on the wording, and she sees in those small behaviours how they fit together with the huge operation of history going on around these women and sometimes drawing them in very much. Can I pressurize you to tell the wonderful story, the first story I heard you telling about this, which is about the woman who was desperate, her brother had gone out, she was desperate to go and join the rising. Will you talk to us?
Okay.
I've forgotten her name. And also I wanted to mention that you have a huge range of class, not just the Spring Rices and the Childers and Elsie Mahaffey, but also the maids, the Centre City people and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in, I talked about women whose stories interested me, and it didn't matter to me who they were. Yeah. Pat wants to hear about Kate Byrne, sometimes called Catherine Byrne, but she calls herself Kate. She was one of a family of 13 children, and the whole family was active in whatever was happening nationally at any time. And Kate had about 4 or 5 brothers, and her brother Patty had gone out. His mobilization order came, and he went out early Easter Monday morning. And Kate and her sister Alice were walking around Dublin. They went home, and her mother, Mrs. Burns, said, "Your brother is out. The scrap is starting. Get your kit and go," because Kate and Alice were both members of Cumann. So out they went. And Alice went to Liberty Hall to see what was happening there, but Kate wanted to go to the GPO, and she saw Michael Staines, later head of the Garda, I think, the first head of the Garda, leading a battalion of men on O'Connell Street. So she got at the end and just started marching behind them. She was the last person in line. And you can tell they're coming from North Dublin, because she said, he yelled right turn, so she made the right turn too. And so they were heading right into the GPO, and she's just following along. But when she got to the door, Staines stopped her and said she couldn't come in. And then he said, one of my 2 or 3 favorite lines of the Rising, he said, "I'll tell Patty on you." So what's interesting in this and in many of the Bureau of Military History statements, the women don't say how they felt, they just say what they did. So she said, "I waited around," and she went to the side of the GPO. In the front of the GPO, all the windows had been broken and there were sandbags and things put in them, but she found a window on the side that hadn't been broken, and she got 2 volunteers that she knew to lift her up, and she kicked in the glass. I mean, we talk about the glass ceiling now, but this was perpendicular to that. She kicked in the glass and jumped in. And she landed on top of a volunteer named Joe Gahan, who said to her, "What the bloody hell are you doing here?" And he also pointed out to her that she was bleeding, because that would happen if you don't, kick it neatly. There's going to be sharp edges there. Then Liam Clark wounded himself with an explosive that went off in an untimely way, not wounding him, and they brought Kate and they said, "Here's your first case." So she was immediately put to work and made herself useful. But she tells this story twice in her pension application, and which is in the 1930s, and in her Bureau of Military History statement, because there was no official record of her having entered the GPO. If her mother hadn't said, "Your brothers are out, go," her mobilization order would have come later. But everything was, you can see in her case, everything for the women is just a little bit later. And she's walking at the back. She has to come in a weird way. And her mobilization order came later. So she kept having, in fact, in this book, we have pictures of a supporting letter from one of the 2 men who lifted her up, saying, "I hoisted her up to the window." And there's a letter, we have a picture of it in here, because these are all in her pension application, from Joe Gahan, who said she landed on top of me, But even with this, it took her a very long time to get a pension, and she was out the entire week doing things and working in different garrisons and carrying messages and treating wounded and so forth. So that's the scale that you wanted. Yeah.
I mean, as they say, sad verse. The other thing
Yeah.
that left a big impression on me was, and there have been some more versions of these episodes, these encounters in the dramatizations that are happening now. But your chapter, I think it's called The Kilmainham Farewell,
Right.
is extraordinarily powerful and poignant. I think partly because one comes on it in the middle of these other quotidian details, concrete things, small behaviours, as you say. Would you feel able to say anything about the Kilmainham Farewell chapter, the experience of writing it, or what you
Right.
think stands out most?
Yeah. No, I'll talk about. I only gave that as a talk once because it made me very sad, and the whole audience was sad. And everybody said they were trying not to cry, but I came at that. Okay, this is a chapter about the women's accounts of saying goodbye to the men who were about to be executed in Kilmainham, and it was mostly, but not entirely, women who visited the men. But the interesting thing to me was that the same the encounter happened over and over and over again. And I will tell you what it was, and then I will give you the examples. Basically, it was that the men had reached a kind of calm in which they had accepted the fact that they were going to die in an hour or an hour and a half or a few hours or so, and they didn't want hysterics. They didn't want tears and people saying, "Oh, this is terrible." They wanted women to be calm and basically and businesslike. Sean McDermott is worried that he owes his landlady money. You know, they wanted to be businesslike and calm and no tears. What was interesting about this is that I had a lot of accounts of this. Some historians that I know, probably what used to be called revisionist historians, are very skeptical about the Bureau of Military History witness statements. And they always say, "Oh, they gave them years later, they didn't remember, it's just in memory," and so forth. But not the ones that I use. First of all, they were completely consistent with the pension applications from 15 years earlier. They told very much the same stories. And I often found 4 or 5 or 6 women who all told the same story. And in this case, that happened. So that both Kathleen Clark and her sister Madge Daly talk about saying goodbye forever to Ned Daly. And Eilidh O'Hanrahan talks about saying goodbye with her sister Anna to Micheál O'Hanrahan. And they say it in very much the same words and everything. And Kathleen Clark, of course, the night before, which was still May 2nd, May 3rd, it talks about saying goodbye to Tom Clark. And all of these details are very consistent. And on, I thought it must have been May 3rd, just to tell you what I thought was an interesting feminist angle on this. The military came to Kathleen Clark's house where Madge Daly, Laura Daly, and Kathleen Clark were, and told them they were going to drive them to Kilmainham to see Ned. And Madge Daly talks about how they were shaking and could barely get dressed. So they go in the British lorry to Kilmainham, and there's many women's accounts, 5 or 6 or 7, all exactly the same about what the drive to Kilmainham is like, and how it's dark, and it's they can't see, and they keep being stopped by soldiers with bayonets, and the people driving the car they're in says, you know, King's Messenger, and then they're allowed to go on. But they all describe it very vividly. And they're still shaking when they're in the car, but Madge Daly is trying to give them confidence and force, and she says, "Remember, we are the daughters and nieces of Fenians." And although that sounds as if there's no, what about the women? You know, there's no term for them. In fact, it made them a kind of revolutionary elite, and they were very proud of it. And it meant, so you don't break down and cry in Kilmainham, you remember, you know, who you are. It goes back very far. So they get into, they walk into Kilmainham, and there's a guard at the door who shouts, "Sisters of Daly to be shot in the morning." That's their welcome to Kilmainham. So Sisters of Daly be shot in the morning, just in case nobody knew who they were, just in case it was doubt. they say goodbye to Ned. I won't go into all because I could take forever. It's all in the book. But they say goodbye to him. And have you been to Kilmainham and seen the stairways from the south? As they're walking down the stairway, Laura Daly seems to falter. And as Madge says, she was Ned's special chum. And Madge tells her to be strong, and Laura says, never fear. But she can feel her faltering. They get down there, and they see the O'Hanrahan sisters there. And Eily O'Hanrahan thinks that Micheál is going to be transported to England. And Madge and Kathleen Clark feel that she needs to be told the truth so she doesn't discover it when she's in the cell with him. And they tell her, no, he's going to be executed. And they say she gives a loud moan and begins, she almost faints. And they say, no, you've got to be strong. Don't act like that in front of Micheál. You can't do that in front of him. And so she pulls herself together. And again, she tells this story, Madge tells the story, Kathleen Clark tells the story. So they go up and they talk with Micheál, he's fine, he's just worried about how his mother and sisters are going to manage economically. I think they had a store. They say goodbye to him. They walk down the stairs, and Eily O'Hanrahan faints at the bottom of the stairs, and then pulls herself together. The feminist angle on this is that the women have to preserve their dignity and their calm before two sets of men, before the men who are about to be executed and before the military who are in the jail. Because they're the daughters and nieces of Fenians, they can't look defeated because they're undefeated, but they can't make the men hysterical. And so the one group of sisters communicates this to the other group of sisters in the 2 or 3 minutes that they are together. But the final thing about this that interests me is the way they still have the feelings that they weren't allowed to express in front of any of the men. And so Laura has been shaking and faltering. Eily O'Hanrahan faints at the bottom of the stairs, and Kathleen Clark has a miscarriage several weeks later. So that they hold themselves in as long as they need to, but then in their bodies the anxiety and the tension is expressed. That's the Kilmainham farewell.
Oh, thank you. And we're drawing the formal part to a close, and then we'll have a larger interaction. But I'm going to pressurize you I just want to ask you 2 more questions.
Sure.
One is, before we finish, and if you like, leave this till the end. Do mention I've forgotten the name of the woman, but the woman who took the dispatch to Kilkenny. We'll come back to her. But I did want to ask you is it Kilkenny? Waterford.
I think it's Waterford.
Anyway, you remember the story. Maybe we could finish the formal part of that. But I did want to ask you what is a slightly more somber question, or with a more somber, but also a kind of a powerful answer. That when you launched this book when we launched this book at the RIA, or when it was launched, you did mention a particular reason why you realised after beginning this research why you had been drawn to it.
Right.
And it's kind of a personal and a family reason.
Okay. Well, there are 2 reasons. My mother's brother was the first American casualty of the Spanish Civil War, and he was born in 1916 and died in February 1937. He's mentioned in a book about the Spanish Civil War that's about to be published in 2 weeks. And so he was an idealist who was a martyr, and it's so much like the experience of descendants of 1916. Nobody talked about him much. It was just too traumatic, and it was a mystery to me. He died before I was born, and I wanted to know more, but everybody was too upset to talk about him. And so I thought that I was interested in 1916, not only because of Kathleen Clark, but at some level I couldn't write about my Uncle Joe, so I was writing about all these other people.
Who died young.
Yeah, died young, and idealists. Idealists who some people thought should not have died, and other people did, and so forth. But when I was finishing the book, I thought, yes, but I wrote about the women. I didn't write really about the men who died. I wrote about the women who survived. So I wasn't really writing about Joe at all. And then I was thinking about my last chapter, and I was looking at a woman who no one else talks about her. Her name is Mairead Kelly, and she's the younger sister of former President Chantal Kelly, who at that point was not former president, but Pierce's staff officer. And Mairead, unlike Kate Byrne, Mairead couldn't jump through windows. She could never quite find a garrison that worked for her. And everywhere she was, she felt, I was doing work that wasn't useful. And her brother, one of her many brothers, would say, why don't you go home and see how Mother's doing? So she would go home and see how Mother was doing. She would come back, and she could never quite find her way in. And that made me think of the Rising, as it was given the military strategy, as a site that you had to enter. You were either in it or not. You had to enter it. And some women went in with no trouble. Some had to jump through windows. And some, like Mairead, never quite found her way in, and her obituary said that she lived a quiet life and was rarely seen in public. And I thought, yep, I'm not surprised with that. And then I thought, I'm writing this book because it's the story of professional women in my own generation. You know, it's about how we entered the male territory of the professions. Some people with great confidence. I mean, Linda called me formidable, and you know, I've been waiting 40 years to be called formidable. I would have been, way beneath the radar until recently. So to be called formidable, finally I can die now. I can die happy. But I thought, I really am writing this book because it's a displaced way of talking about the women of my generation.
Brilliant. Just tell us that last story, which is a very funny story, and also a very revealing one about gender. About the carrying the dispatch.
Yeah, and I think it's the story of Maeve Kavanagh, who was also a poet, and James Connolly called her the poetess of the revolution, and she loved that. She thought that was wonderful. And she was sent to Ginger O'Connell, and who was in charge of Waterford and Wexford and maybe other places down here, in charge of the volunteers, to tell him that contrary to the many other messages he'd received, the Rising was on. And he said, no, it's too late. I've already sent the men home. Oh, they were in Kilkenny. That's where they went, right?
That's what I thought.
And she urged him to go, and he said no, he couldn't. The men were out. And she said to him, an old woman could take Kilkenny today. It's so easy to take, and I was just there, it's very small. An old woman could take Kilkenny today. And he said, I won't let you near my men. She wasn't an old woman. Anybody could take Kilkenny. It's so easy, just claim it. But he refused to do it. And then he burst into tears, and he said, I'll be called a traitor. And she said that later she heard that when he was imprisoned, because he had done enough to get himself imprisoned, which was the goal of many men, I have to say, in the Rising, he complained about the hysterical women that were sent to him from Dublin. And she said, if anyone was hysterical, it was not I.
I love that story. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So, shall we, you will certainly want to make comments, to ask questions, to make observations. There is someone here whose grandmother brought the dispatch saying the Rising was going on to Waterford. That's all, Claire Connolly. I just found that out the other day.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to mastermind this, because I can't see. So who wants to say something first?
Or Linda, you could break the ice, and then maybe somebody will follow a question.
Someone break the window and jump through it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I do want to.
Well, thank you very much for that discussion and those stories. Speaking about formidable women and just to kick through the window.
Yeah.
That last story actually very much reminded me of the lady in Waterford who welcomed back, who was in Waterford when was it King James returned after the battle, was trouncing at the Battle of the Boyne, where he ran from the field. And he was back in his house in Waterford, on the man somewhere looking out the window, raging about how bad the Irish were at fighting, what cowards they were. And she said, well, if there was if it was competition was for running, you certainly wouldn't have it. I think there was a long line of formidable women.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Next.
Yeah. Piers.
Thanks very much, Lucy. I mean, my difficulty is not at all about women and men in the revolution, because I think you very rightly established that there were active women, activist women, as well as activist men. It's rather where the generality of Irish people kind of situated themselves in the middle of all of this. Let's be honest, extraordinarily revolutionary and epoch-making changes. So if I've been citing my own grandfather, I mean, I'm one of the few people that say my grandfather was in the GPO. He was. But he was wearing an RSC uniform. And there was a POW during the events of 1916. And after it went on to be, in effect, a spy for the IRA and Michael Powell. And I'm wondering how you can kind of, there's always a suggestion nowadays that if you aren't one of these heroic figures, men or women, in 1916, somehow you're less of a person. And I don't really see it like that, even though I'm not a revisionist, and I dislike the discourse of revisionists. So I'm wondering, how do you construct this kind of, how would I say, the dialogue or the discourse between these undoubtedly revolutionary people and the rest of the population?
Well, first of all, I would say that it seems to me that this centenary is very different from the 50th anniversary, because it's my impression that what you said really fits more with the 50th, when the important people were the famous ones who are now famous, and there was one view of the rising, that it was good, it was a good thing, it was right, it was important and foundational. It seems to me now it's much more pluralist. I mean, everyone's talking about the women. There's a lot about Irish women in the First World War, and so I think there's a much more open attitude now, with the expectation of a lot of different kinds of politics, really. So I think now is the time not to worry about your grandfather, or to write something about. You have written something about him, because I've read it, actually. But you wanted, a conversation between ordinary people and people who were out in the... I can give you a conversation that happened. When Louise Gavin Duffy, who was... well, let me say this. I think scholarship now uncovers the ambivalence of people who were around then, who were out then, because even Louise Gavin Duffy arrived at the GPO. She'd been teaching with Pierce, so that had been her career before, and she said this. She arrived at the GPO, asked for Pierce, and said, "This is a big mistake. This is wrong. You're going to lose, but I want to be out in the field in some way." And so he said, "Would you like to work in the kitchen?" And she wanted to be away from the bullets, but in the center of the action. So she, I don't mean because she was a coward, but I mean she didn't want to be killing people, but she wanted to do something. So she worked in the kitchen the whole time. She evacuated at the very end when the building was burning and falling to pieces. She went back to her boarding house, and her landlady knew that Louise had been out, and the landlady was very worried that her husband had been a policeman, and she was very worried that he wouldn't get his pension, that whatever happened would mean that all Irish people would be punished, this kind of thing you're looking for, and he wouldn't get his pension. And she kept complaining about that, but then she would interrupt herself and say to Louise, "They lasted a whole week, isn't it grand?" But then she'd go back to her husband's pension. She's going back and forth like that.
That's a wonderful story. Yeah.
So that's wonderful.
Great.
I hope I've answered your question in there somewhere.
I think I don't want to monopolize. I try to be precise. If we have resolved this kind of black-white,
Yeah.
like in my own case, I mean, my grandfather's story, being in GPO, wearing Harris uniform, would have been seen as sort of a treachery of some kind.
I know, but now it's more interesting because everybody, we're used, there are lots of volunteers, but how many people like that were there? So, I mean, I think it has more edge to it, you know?
Well, I suppose,
Have we asked enough of those questions yet?
well,
I think this is the time when they are being asked. For instance, the consul general in New York, when she's through with 1916 at the end of April, she's invited Michael Longley to talk about the Battle of the Somme.
Rightly.
So I think this season that is being done. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Now, who else would like to ask or make a comment?
I might just say something. So
Yeah.
I think that conversation has started. Roy Foster, for instance, uses the notion of generations to
Yeah.
try and theorise or explain,
Yeah.
exactly what you're talking about, the different backgrounds. Now, it has been criticised, I think, John, you criticised the book for, having a very class-biased perspective of what the revolutionary generation are, and also, or perhaps over-focusing on Dublin to the neglect of these women here and other groups outside of Dublin. So, but I do think that kind of nuance, the complexities,
Yeah.
around class, region, and I suppose trying to explain this overall foment has started, but certainly an awful lot more needs to be done.
But can I
Yes.
say something
Yeah.
to that, which is that I didn't find that generational difference that Roy found, because there was Mrs. Burns saying to Kate, go, your brothers are out there, go. And
Yeah.
Mrs. Boland said to Harry,
Yeah.
your father's ghost would haunt you if you didn't go out. So I found almost evenly mothers pushing their children out the door, or mothers locking them in so they wouldn't go. And it was sort of balanced, really.
Yeah.
I suppose it's,
Yeah.
I mean, speaking as someone who remembers the 1966 commemoration vividly, being quite young, I mean, this is a perfectly obvious point, but I think it has altered the conversation very much, and it's what started to happen very openly in the North in 1969, and everything since, up to the peace process, and obviously it's still going on. I mean, that totally, I think it made the sort of position that was put forward, and was, as you said, a very dominant, unshadowed narrative in 1966, it made that position untenable,
Yeah.
rightly.
Yeah.
And I suppose I sort of feel a bit, I know people have used the word revisionism a lot, but I sort of feel as if we're a bit freer now, actually, to celebrate the extraordinary courage of these people, male and female, even if we might disagree with their discourse, as I do with Pierce's blood
Yeah.
sacrifice stuff. But I think that's one of the things that very seriously, apart from the humour and the entertainment and the vividness of it, that's something that this book does, is it complicates the issue and it takes account of the complexities of the situation then, as against the oversimplifications of 1966.
Right. Well, for instance, one of the unionist women I talk about is Mary Louisa Hamilton Norway, whose husband was the British bureaucrat in charge of the GPO. And she was writing letters to her sister every day, and he wrote a memoir also. And Keith Jeffrey, who alas just died a few weeks ago, Keith Jeffrey did a wonderful edition called The Sinn Féin Rebellion as They Saw It, because her letters were called, it wasn't a Sinn Féin Rebellion, as you know, but called The Sinn Féin Rebellion as I Saw It. She saw it. Anyway, so Mary Louisa Hamilton Norway is important in my book because she and her husband were English, so they had property all over the place. I mean, they left some possessions in England. In Dublin, they were living in what was the Royal Hibernian Hotel, which was right off Dawson Street. And they left their most treasured possessions somewhere else. They didn't want them in a hotel. Their older son had just died the year before, 1915, on the front in France. And their most treasured possessions were his things, which they would never see him again. But she had all the birthday presents that he had given her and things like that, and she left them in right after his death in 1915. She left them in the safest place in Dublin, which was her husband's office in the GPO. And so after the Rising, I mean, she writes her sister, and I found you can't not find it moving, going through the ashes, when the GPO, when they cooled and you could go in looking for his things. I mean, it's heartbreaking. But what I also found, which was interesting, was the Bureau of Military History account of the volunteers who broke into the safe in Hamilton Norway's office and found these things. And they found, one of them says, they found a lock of the fair hair of the director's son who had been killed. And they, it's beautifully put. They don't destroy it, and they don't steal the money. Volunteers were very honest. They just leave it there. But when you read all these things, and those are, of course, men's accounts, you get both points of view on that. But that's very moving, her things. And I have her in there in the chapter on emotions. I don't think anybody else had written on emotions in 1916, and I have a
Which
long
reminds
chapter
me,
on
and
that.
I suppose, well, it reminds niece when she was saying goodbye to him. And her mother,
right.
she said she couldn't eat her breakfast, and her mother said, is that the right
Yeah.
person? What's the story?
Yeah. What did she say? Her mother said...
He was getting dressed and leaving, and they all knew that they wouldn't see him again.
Right. And so Sheila Humphreys, who was
That's
later
it,
a very sort of diehard Republican, told her mother, after she'd said goodbye to her uncle, Leo Rahley, that she couldn't even eat. And her mother said pretty much, pull yourself together. And her mother had no patience with the fact that she couldn't eat, and that, it was not a time to express feelings and so forth. So I have I talk a lot about people who said they couldn't feel or they weren't allowed to feel. What
She
was her
said, giving in to yourself.
Don't
You're
give
giving
in
in to yourself.
Yeah.
That's classed,
But
though,
of
as
course,
well,
that's
isn't
the
it?
first,
Yeah.
that's Monday, though.
Yeah,
By the end of the
yeah.
week, it was different then.
Can I just do an unfair thing and ask John for a second? We had a conversation there in UCC a few
Yeah.
weeks ago about the women in Centre City Dublin who jeered at the rebels as they were being marched off and who greatly opposed the thing. And I mean, I don't know if you have anything about this, because they're not women
They're
who
not
were writing.
writers.
They
They're
didn't
not
write
writers.
anything. Would you say a tiny bit about that? Just
yeah.
a different group of women.
I'm getting a lot of shout outs from Pat and Linda, appreciate it.
This is John Borgonovo, by the way.
The separation allowance,
Yeah,
women.
so the we call it separation women. Actually, I got in real trouble. I gave a talk in Galway and I got roasted about all this. But there was this working class woman who received a separation allowance. Had kind of an identity. They were called separation women. It was very much class and gender.
Because their husbands were fighting on the front in the Great War.
Their husbands were fighting, and they had an elevated position, not just economically, but also socially, because their husbands were in service. And they became a very vocal advocates of the British war effort. And they were very active. All over urban Ireland, you have different experiences. And here in Cork, they would have been very much engaged in a lot of vocal and even street violence against Republicans in 1917, 1918. But all across urban Ireland, whenever you get this working class, critical mass of working class people, they took on this identity, this very vocal, visible identity. And so in the Rising, when we always talk about the people of Dublin booing and heckling the rebels, it seemed to have been predominantly these separation women who were the most vocal and the most visible doing so. And it also makes a lot of sense too, because they were also living in the neighborhoods that were most severely hit by artillery and bullets.
I suppose they were being raised from utter destitution by the pensions.
They were right, and they were also being treated like they were being paid. They had a social credit because their people were serving in the front at a time when Irish enlistments were very low compared to the rest of the UK. So they felt patriotic. And there was a lot of resentment against them, not just among Republicans, but also among mainstream nationalists. There was always talk about them being drunk, and there was actually a double inquiry investigation into the fact that they were drinking up their pension or their separation allowance. But it was like a moral, but it was a moral panic about them rather than about whether their own behavior, the idea that they were above their station. And so that's totally that kind of class tension is totally visible there.
Can I tell you a story about that? This is from Robert Brennan's autobiography, so it's not from a woman, but I love his book Allegiance, which is out of print. Bob Brennan was one of the leaders of the Rising in Wexford. And
Maeve Brennan's father.
Maeve Brennan's father.
He was also a writer.
He got his writing talent from his daughter Maeve. And when they took over the Athenaeum in Wexford for a few days, and the very first day, the separation allowance, women came to complain because there were no more British authorities there and they weren't going to get their money. And so Brennan realized they had to pay these women. And so they gave them the money, and as the women, they apparently gave them more than they usually got, because one of the women said to the other, "Glory be to God, Katie, isn't this a grand government?"
That's a great story. Andy Wheelenberg.
I just wanted to ask you, Lucy, about pension funds, which are very recently come out. There's a lot
Right.
of new evidence there.
Right.
But actually, the common on files are a lot more interesting for one reason, and that's because they're a hell of a lot longer. They just
Right.
go on and on and on. But in the 50s, they still haven't got the pension. They're
Oh,
still
it's
writing.
terrible, yeah.
And also they get questioned and questioned, and the stuff comes back. And
Yeah.
So they're voluminous files that have a lot of information.
Right.
And actually, in any given locality, you can learn a lot more from these files.
Absolutely.
The ordinary guys have got the pension straight away in the 1920s already.
Why didn't they get it? Is it
Because there's two reasons. One is that there was a Miss Kennedy who was very nasty to all these women. I've discussed this with Eve Morrison, who's done a lot of work on them, and she and I said, yes, Miss Kennedy. When you read the things, the men involved are willing to give these women their pensions and to believe them, but Miss Kennedy is we've all met these women who hate other women,
There's
right?
always
Who don't
one.
believe them. And Miss Kennedy is saying not enough information, and that's why we have then the letters of the man who hoisted Kate Byrne up and the man that she fell on top of. I mean, it's all overproved, and Miss Kennedy is still saying no, and so more letters and more letters and more letters. But as you say, it's these blips and obstacles that then generate more social history.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Marianne,
Yeah.
and I suppose we'll have to wind down then.
I thought maybe a woman's voice might be good. I think it's a very important thing there to bring up the idea of using the material that you're using in terms of using what has been termed minor genres of literature, looking at basically diaries and letters and so on, and looking at what leads eventually to oral history, which is, again, sorry for the historians here, but indeed has been regarded up to recently as a minor genre history again, and distrusted really. And what really interested me here would be your view on that term that you used, borrowing from Robert Duffman,
Small behaviors.
and how that may be contested really as a term, as a category. Would it be?
Contested by whom?
Yeah, why?
From a feminist point of view, probably looking at why would we look at it and why would we use the term small behavior and continue to use the term?
Well, I used it because, as I discovered, I was looking at, among other things, the way women shared public space with men, and therefore how they got into the garrisons, how they, Mairead Kelly, who just can't get in, Kate Byrne, who jumps in. That's rich material for showing you, what was it like for women in male-dominated public space. And that's how you find out. You don't find out with getting, 200 women did this and 75 women did this. You get it from the stories where they say, I was in that room, I was in this room, I wasn't allowed in, and so forth. And it's the phrase I use in the book, I look at encounters in the field, and you have to see how the women describe it.
I suppose the point is that they were nominated. They were put down as merely small behaviours. Do you know what I mean? By
But
the
small
dominant
didn't-
narrative.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Small
But
did
one
not
can
mean
deal with it.
insignificant.
Yeah,
It just
yeah,
meant
yeah.
not an epic suite. It meant
yes.
really visually
Yes.
and physically small, like the way somebody looks at somebody or enters a room. It didn't mean insignificant. Yeah.
I suppose we'll have to draw. Oh yes, Sandra.
Just a comment, thank you very much. But I think one of the interesting things that you do is from those small behaviours construct a very strong argument about gender,
Yeah.
which I think historians could learn a lot from. Speaking as a historian myself, it's a hugely
hugely impressive book. And it is the way in which you construct the arguments that is most impressive of all.
Thank you, Sandra. That's a very fitting conclusion, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
So,
the rehabilitation of small, I suppose.
yes, that's
Yes.
right. Yeah.
Yes.
So, thank you all for coming and for being so incredibly focused and
Attentive.
and
Yeah.
lively. And thanks to Linda and Kay and Rebecca for organising it.
And this man
Lucy.
here.
I call greeting for me there. So can we
So likewise, I just want to
Sorry,
sincerely
I
thank
didn't want to
Pat
do it.
and Lucy as well, just for, I could listen all night to the stories and, you know, not only do you like reading stories, you're brilliant at telling
them, yeah.
which is a skill. So I just want to finish really just again by thanking Kay and Rebecca Hart, who set up this wonderful project. I also want to thank my colleagues Maureen O'Connor, Sandra McAvoy and John Borganova, who've been feeding ideas into this project as well, and Kevin Smith, who's the designer of the project. We have one sample here tonight
That's lovely.
of one
That's
image,
great, yeah.
and just to say, you know, keep an eye out in the weeks ahead when you're walking through the market. We have images over here, we have a timeline, a roll of honour for the Cork Coming Along members. We have a surprise up here where the Cork Food Capital of Ireland is. As I said, interacting with the images, we'll have texts. You know, that the witness statements are very important. I've been reading some of them. I mentioned Peg Duggan from Thomas Davis Street. You can look these up online. Mural McSweeney's, they're all fascinating pieces of social history, and they're exactly, you could be talking about the same kinds of things, Lucy, that you're talking about in your book. So we look forward over the course of the year to engaging in further conversations and to really an exciting programme of events. Our launch is on the opening is on the 25th of April. The Sunday Times journalist Justine McCarthy will be speaking that night. We'll have some of the students from UCC or Drama and Theatre will be reading out some speeches with the statements, letters, etc. And then, as I said, the Hedge School will be in May. So we'll keep you on our list and keep you posted. So, did you want to say something else?
I just wanted to make it not entirely a frivolous proposal, but I doubt if anyone, maybe Conal could do it. We should close with a rendition of Salonika, as in my husband's First World War song, folks, spoken by a woman.
And the books are on sale in...
The books are on sale.
Over
Where?
here, Jonathan Walker's
Wonderful.
here.
Yes. Will you sign them? Yes.
Yeah, all right. So maybe when we have a
That's the
finisher
end.
one, we might sing. Thank you very much,
Great
everyone,
song.
for attending.
It was the coats that did it. It was the two coats. It was the two coats.
It was really good.
The two dyed coats. What?
They were entirely receptive.
Wasn't that great story? Isn't this a grand government?
We have two gifts for you. I forgot to ask Rebecca to give them to you. They're here. I'll give them to you in a minute.
What are you giving me?
Gifts. I forgot to say that Rebecca was going to present you with some gifts, but I think you're very
I can't hear a single word you're
Gifts.
saying.
Rebecca has gifts for
Has
you,
gifts
and
for
Linda
you.
forgot to
Yeah.
give them
Oh,
to you.
and Rebecca is Kay's daughter.
Yeah, she's the manager.
Isn't that a wonderful story though about glory be to God? Katie is